Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK, where we apply the practical philosophy of objectivism to current events, well, to everything, as philosophy should be applied. Today, we have our very special guest and a man behind the scenes, Daniel Kraus, and we're going to be talking about reparations in California. Now, back in 2020, Gavin Newsom appointed a council to get together and figure out this thing called slavery reparations. Wherein the state of California would be, I think, the first state in the union to legalize reparations, how those reparations would be paid for, the justification for the reparations, et cetera, were part of what this committee was supposed to, the solutions the committee was supposed to come up with. They have produced a 1,000+ page report on this. And legislation is pending. Lots of people suspected Gavin Newsom appointed this council with no intention of actually implementing any of the laws in it or the moral sanctions in it, but simply to appease, the very virulent left and the rising voices of people on the left who are claiming that reparations are a just thing. So we're going to talk about that. Are reparations good? So lots of thinkers out there have made cases for reparations. Another question that I think we should answer, because this whole piece of legislation, or the potential legislation is premised on it, is: has slavery affected the Black community today? Or the pathologies that we see that are largely ensconced in that community related to slavery or to something else? I mean, these are things that we're going to try to pick apart a little bit today. Daniel, you had an opportunity to read the article a little bit more thoroughly than I did. So let's tell folks about it for those of the people watching who are not familiar with the California reparations thing. Let's talk a little bit about that. What's that all about?
So the reason why the topic came out today is recently there's been a new UC Berkeley poll, basically asking California residents what they think about this whole idea, and it looks like 60%. So most people agree that slavery still affects today's Black residents, and it's specifically in California. So they were asking, do you think Black residents in California are affected by slavery? 60% believe they are. 27% think it's by a great deal. 20% think there is some effect, and 13% say that there is like a small effect. And 30%, surprisingly enough, don't think there is any effect. So what do you think about these like percentages before we go to the specifics?
I think they reflect the stupidity of the California electorate. We have to remember that this is a group of human beings who elected Governor Newsom for a second time when he was recalled, when his record was clear, when they had the opportunity to oust the guy who's probably the worst governor in state history. They voted for him in overwhelming numbers. This is to a tune of like 60%, which gave him the sense that he had the sanction to do pretty much anything he wanted to do in the state of California. And we're feeling the effects of that, right? 350,000 people exiting the state every year, a tax base leaving, the middle class disappearing. We're having the California is rapidly becoming a state wherein only the rich and the subsidized rich and the subsidized poor can live. The middle class and the tax base are moving elsewhere. So it's extraordinary to me that, but not not just because they're the California electorate. That doesn't make them stupid just because they're a California electorate. But it's not surprising to me that with the propaganda blitz that we've been getting from the left through academia and in popular culture, that more or less makes Western civilization, and America in particular, the most evil empire in the world. And based upon the institution of slavery, capitalism itself, the narrative now tells us, is based upon the institution of slavery. It's not surprising to me that, given the now formidable foundation that slavery supposedly held in our culture, that 60% of the people think that it's still, that the repercussions are still reverberating today. In California, mind you, which entered the Union in the mid-1840s as a free state.
Yeah, I actually have that. So it banned slavery in 1849, although in the article I read there was like some loophole around it. But even then, in 1852, there were about 200 and at most 1,500 slave descendants. in California, mind you.
And the slavery picture in America is extremely nuanced. This is something that the supposed advocates of nuance always leave out of the picture. So when you're talking about slave descendants, it's really difficult to know exactly what you're talking about, since there was a good percentage of Black slave owners, some of them who purchased their family members, some of them who actually profited from the slave trade. There is a great deal of intermingling of the races in the South, and many migrants may have been, the privileged few that inherited wealth and property, and even other slaves from their quote unquote masters with whom they had relationships with. It's such an incredibly difficult situation to parse out, right? Even if you were to find the descendants of those 200 descendants, it'd be super hard to figure out who was in chattel slavery, who was profiting from chattel slavery. You'd have to do an immense amount of research just to do that. Of course, that's not what they want to do. They want to draw a hard racial line between Black and white, and if you're Black, I suppose you'll get an immediate reparation. If you're white, you have to pay it.
And you can see this sort of I don't know what to even call it, but maybe like principle versus the practical kind of dichotomy almost all Americans have. Like even in this poll, like as I said, 60% support, or say that Black descendants are still, or Black residents are still affected by the legacy of slavery, yet also 60% don't think there should be any cash reparations. And 53% said it's unfair to single out a single group to do any reparations. And surprisingly, 20% even said that it would cost too much, which is surprising to hear from Californian residents.
Well, I mean, we're in the red, so maybe they're starting to feel the pinch that, that these things actually matter. Yeah, it would cost too much. I mean, in the neighborhood of, I don't remember what the exact numbers are. Are they listed in the article? But
I think I saw something. It might be something like 0.5% to 1% of GDP of California, which California has a big GDP. I think it is, if it was like a lone country, I think it's in top 10. So it's a lot, but maybe not as much when you do like a GDP comparison.
Well, part of the horror, I think, that these California residents are feeling was from the sort of the trial balloons that were sent out by the commission that claimed, that every descendant of slaves should receive a house for like $1, and they should have $1 million compensation. People just, when they were confronted with the actual ludicrousness of those numbers, they backed off. Now, if I do believe that there are people in the South who probably deserve reparations from the states in the South and from companies in the South who practiced Jim Crow and who benefited financially from Jim Crow and who hurt Blacks in Jim Crow, those who were able to remain, or even those who were forced out to other parts of the country to avoid Jim Crow. There's certainly something to be said for practices like redlining, states deliberately keeping Blacks from growing economically. There's something to be said for that, in part because those descendants are probably still alive. The people who are directly hurt by those,
or even the people who were directly affected by Jim Crow.
The actual people themselves, right? One of the main moral sticking points for me is that no slave, no person brought over in the Atlantic slave trade from the 1600s on exists today. No white person is a beneficiary of that today. They're not a predator they're not predating the Black community as they did then, and they should not have to pay reparations for that.
So I have a couple more things to bring up, but first let's go to our super chat. So we have a super chat from Catherine. Thank you so much. She's saying, paying for the sins of our fathers.
Right. I mean, this is like something that was banned in the formation of our early Constitution. The idea that the crime of the father should reverberate generationally through a family. That was something that did exist before, the subjugation of government to moral law, which we call rights. And so now the crime stops at the people who committed the crime, and it doesn't reflect on the generations that follow. I know personally, I don't even think my ancestors were here in the 19th century. And if they were here, they were in Canada, which was a refuge for slaves. So there's not a single person in my family who benefited from the slave trade, even though I'm sure I could find African studies majors who would attempt to make that correlation. But it just didn't happen with my family. Yeah, and yet I would be on the line for paying for people whom I'd never hurt.
Not to mention also the more well-off blacks in California would also be paying for the more poor, although yeah,
it could be a wealth distribution thing, or it may be even more unjust. A wealthy black who can prove that they're a descendant of slave may get that $1 million buyout anyway. I mean, we see this all the time in welfare statism and statist programs like this all the time. There's this, we think that the statism is supposed to help the benighted, the people who are oppressed, but it also ends up, greasing the palms of people at the top too.
We also have a super sticker from Jonathan. Thank you so much. And another super chat from Catherine. She says, California had some of the worst Jim Crow laws, which I believe it's a joke. I'm not well versed in US history, but I believe California probably didn't have Jim Crow laws.
Well, California certainly had anti-Asian laws, which communists like Jack London were totally in favor of. I'm sure there were racist laws in every state, just like there are racist laws in every country. Unfortunately, for those people who were the recipients of those laws back then, they're not around today. And the march of America has been a fairly consistent march against laws like that, right? To make us more consistently aligned with our moral principles as stated in the Declaration of Independence. So those things existed. I don't know about Jim Crow. I'd have to look that up, but
actually, in the article, it even talked about maybe some possible reparations for the people who were forced into labor camps during the World War II, specifically the Japanese residents.
There already was. I think it said in 1988 there was a $20,000 stipend sent to people who were forced into labor camps by President Roosevelt, a Democrat, by the way. So, and those people deserved it because they had their homes taken away from them, they had their livelihoods taken away from them. They're isolated in camps, and that's an egregious overstep by the government, and they should have received reparations. And as far as I know, they did. And those people, the direct recipients and the direct ancestors of those people within one generation were the beneficiaries of it, as they should have been.
So quickly, we have a member chat from Bonnie. She says, who will give reparations in the future to today's taxpayers who will pay for these reparations?
Of course, yeah, you're right, but nobody, because if you have enough money to pay for these reparations, or to be considered in the class that should pay for these reparations, you have no sympathy, because you're rich, and the rich don't deserve sympathy.
And also a comment from Catherine. She says Cali absolutely had Jim Crow laws. I'm somewhat surprised about that, because I thought it was like specifically just the South.
It's certainly something that we associate with the South, for sure. I don't know about Jim Crow in California. I'd have to look that up, but I know they had racist legislation, for sure.
We also have a super chat from Ashley. She says, my great grandfather's family sold him to a farmer as a teenager. Used to be a thing because they were so poor. We're white, but... And she shrugged.
Oh, sure. I mean, indentured servitude indentured servants represented a vast majority of the population of America at first. That meant everybody was tied to a type of slavery where they had to pay off, they had to work, and they were the property of that person for a specific time period. And when they were released from that contract, they were free. But up until that time, they could be sold to somebody as well. We grew out of that, thank God. But yes, a lot of people in the white community who are in those conditions, lots of poor Irish and immigrants in America that worked in worse conditions actually than slaves, are often overlooked as minorities that struggled against real oppression, but they did. It's just that one side has political gravitas and the other side doesn't.
No, Catherine specifies racist laws equal Jim Crow laws. So yeah, in that sense, they definitely did. Probably all states had some sort of racist laws. I guess it depends if you specify what exactly is Jim Crow laws.
Yeah, in this case, Jim Crow laws were separate but equal. They were the attempt to segregate whites from blacks in the erroneous attempt to satisfy a constitutional provision, that required equality before the law, equal protections under the law. And the idea was that they could separate these whites from blacks, provided that the services provided were more or less the same. Of course, it was never that way. And it was used to enforce cultural racism. It was a terrible, terrible thing, predominantly with respect to the South. Anti-Asian laws were anti-Asian laws, and yet what I find very interesting is those laws were quite onerous and quite destructive and obstructed the progress of a group of people who happened to be more prosperous than whites. And I think Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams point out this kind of stuff in their numerous books on racism and politics, and even in their in-depth studies on the effects of slavery in future and current generations. They make a pretty solid point that the pathologies that we're seeing today really have nothing to do with slavery. And the points are fairly solid. I mean, when you see the rates of marriage, when you see the rates of family togetherness, when you see the nuclear nature of the family, the spirituality of the Black community, all of which were much, much, much higher immediately following slavery and in the decades following slavery than they are in the decades following the Great Society, which was the welfare state, the birth of the welfare state in the late 60s. That is where a real decline started to happen within the Black community.
So before, we don't have much time. So first, thank you, Jason, for your super chat. He says, not to mention 300,000 Union soldiers that died to end it, meaning slavery, and how it affected their descendants.
There's that. I mean, the institution of slavery was insidious in a lot of ways. It affected the white working class in insidious ways. It literally destroyed it. It decimated it, not only because it created a stigma to manual labor that the lower classes found it hard to break out of, that there was no way that you can compete against the free labor of a slave, or even one that was loaned out, because oftentimes if a slave had a skill, their master would loan them out for money. They could make money on their own, but they would have to pay a stipend back to, like a sort of commission to the slave master. But still, the prices, I don't think were of the nature of a competition for white slave labor. So it pushed them out. It's one of the reasons we still have the slave states of the South are amongst the poorest in the Union.
So just to quickly go over a couple more things. They were in the article, they were also talking like, why is support for slave reparations not higher? And they blame the right-wing media. Also, surprising thing, cash payments were slightly more popular among women, younger voters, and those born in the US. So for immigrants are much less supportive of these reparations, which makes sense since they literally, even if you buy into this argument of your descendant in slavery, with immigrants, you cannot ever make that argument.
Indeed, because immigrants often find themselves in alien cultures where they are politically strapped. Oftentimes, the legal system works against them, and yet they still find prosperity. And Asians in America are a perfect example of that. In fact, Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell often make the correlation that political power does not translate into material prosperity, but many in the Black and the Civil Rights movement have gone towards acquiring political power, but it doesn't trickle down to the lowest in the economic realm. Certain cultural things do. Certain cultural elements like family stick-to-itiveness, the relationship of that group to studying and working, and the work ethic in general. That's what's passed on, and that's what coheses groups and makes them generally more prosperous or less.
Also, we have that the task force that was set up for this recommends going beyond cash payments in things like ending cash bail, which we already seen in at least one state. We actually made an episode about it. They also supported repealing the 3 strikes law, and this was very surprising to see, paying fair market wages to incarcerated people.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but the 13th Amendment does make an exception for involuntary servitude for people who are convicted of crimes, and frankly, you should pay restitution to the victims if you're a criminal. So the fact that they go in there and there may be a sort of work program or work furlough program, but none of that actually goes to the benefit of the victims that they've hurt, is a terrible injustice. Look, you don't have to have a 3 strikes measure. That's true. Make people serve their time. And when they serve their time, it should be for making the victims they've hurt whole. And if you have programs for them, it should be towards changing their minds and personalities about, as Michael Leibowitz has said, it's about the thinking. It's about the criminal's orientation to the world. And there is a form of psychological work, cognitive work that they could do to make them less inclined to commit crimes against people. But prison should be a hard place to live. It should be a place that it shouldn't be a graduation up the ladder. It shouldn't give you cachet, shouldn't give you a reputation with your buddies. It should be a shameful place to go, and you should be made to pay restitution for the crimes you've committed, so that maybe you think twice next time about hurting people.
And just a couple last things. They also supported rent caps, subsidizing down payments. I think it was specifically for Black residents, and interest-free loans.
So all of that is
to kind of combat the redlining.
Yeah, but all of that, so redlining is separating value from reality, and these programs are separating value from reality. Interest rates are a reflection of something real, and part of that is the risk that somebody is taking on to lend you money for resources that they have the possibility of losing, and the level of interest is determined by the level of risk that they're taking. We know how price caps work on housing. It causes scarcity, so that's just going to hurt everybody. And what was the other one?
Subsidizing down payments.
Yeah, none of that. All of that is terrible. All of that incentivizes bad investment. There should be, and it's forcing the property out of some people's hands and redistributing it to others without due process of law. This is just evil all across the board. It's un-American all across the board. And by un-American, I mean, it's so disrespectful of the autonomy and rights of innocent human beings.
Okay, it looks like we're almost out of time. Anything to summarize everything you have to say, Mark?
Yes, I think reparations are going to be, there's going to be a louder and louder voice for people playing on unearned guilt of the white community. You folks out there that never practiced racism, never enslaved another human being in your life, never exploited another human being in your life, should not feel guilty for those who were exploited, because that's not your fault. You should feel, a sense of anger about what happened to those folks in the past and a desire to make the world a better place today. But making the world a better place today won't happen by redistributing some innocent people's wealth into the hands of others who did not earn it. It will be better by more consistently aligning ourselves with the principles of the Declaration of Independence, which means we should all be free and autonomous beings. All right, get the political class out of our lives and your life will be better.
And if you actually want to make some sort of, or somehow help the blacks, the one thing you can do is get rid of things that I don't know, I forgot that word, but that affect the African American disproportionately, such things as drug laws. Get rid of
Yes.
those, and that's
And
one.
anti-gun legislation, gun control laws affect the African American community much more. It leaves them the victims of violent crime, unarmed victims of violent crime, unable to protect and defend themselves against the predators that live in their neighborhoods. Yeah, so all the stuff that comes at us in the guise of being compassionate is really plantation politics. That's all it really is. Get rid of it. Get rid of it.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone else for watching us today. We'll be back with the reality show in a couple of minutes, and also I believe we should have at 10 p.m. UK time, we should also have Life on Earth, but it's not confirmed yet. So, but make sure to watch out. And I believe tomorrow at 10 p.m. UK time, also we have TV talk with Mark Pellegrino, Jacqueline Schumann, and Jennifer
Oh, good.
Puani.
Okay, good to
I
know.
believe that's what I heard. And now even Mark knows. So,
Okay, yeah, I didn't know. I thought it was going to be the following week, but that's great. We'll be. I guess we're talking about after party.
yep.
Okay, good. Good
Okay.
show.
Thank you,
All right, man.
everyone, and bye bye.